everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to today's webinar, DevExtreme and Modularity, Bundles, RequireJS and WebPack, presented by DevExpress Web Program Manager, Mehul Harry. In today's session, he'll show you the new modularity features in DevExtreme 16.1. You'll learn how to create smaller modules using WebPack and load them using RequireJS or JSPM. FYI, this session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everybody as to DevExtreme and Modularity. And today it's all about bundles and technologies like RequireJS and WebPack. And that means this webinar, again, is all about JavaScript and everything related to DevExtreme. So pretty much a lot of what I'm going to be showing today has to do with not necessarily the code, but how do you manage that code in your client-side application. So let's start off with modularity. What exactly is modularity? Now, modularity basically means it's when you divide a system into components and you separate them out. They can be recombined. You can manage dependencies with them, all that good stuff. And so particularly for software in JavaScript, modularity is compartmentalizing a particular set of functionality, which is great because in JavaScript, especially when you've got a lot of different code and so forth, it can get kind of unwieldy. So modularity is a great approach, meaning the ability to create a set of modules and separate out functionality can help you manage a large application much easier. So the good news is, and this is what we're going to be talking about all today, is that DevExtreme now supports modules. We have taken the difficulty of task of creating modules, and I'll explain exactly what that means. And so we now support this concept of modularity, and with it comes the ability to support technologies like RequireJS, which is a module loader, and WebPack, which is a module bundler. Now, this is great because this has some benefits for you. The ability to use modules has great benefits for you. For example, you can have a smaller footprint for your application, and there could be loading performance as well. Now, I say can be and would be because it all depends on what you're using. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But there's a big warning. I want to put this out there. And that is, if you don't know what you're doing, you could absolutely shoot yourself in the foot, meaning that you could potentially not include some module that you may need to use later on, and that could potentially break your site. And so that's why, as they say in, was it Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. We will talk all about that. My goal today is really simple. It's to understand exactly how to use DevExtreme modules with RequireJS and WebPack. I can't really dive into specifics of RequireJS and WebPack, but the good news is after this webinar, I will have a blog post with links to helpful videos and articles and everything that I'm going to show you here today. The GitHub projects, all of that good stuff will be included in that. And that you can find on devexpress.com. You just click on the blogs link and you'll find our blogs. So don't worry, I'll explain all that. But to really dive into this stuff would take a lot longer because you can go into hours and hours worth of those technologies. But it's better to understand exactly what the concept-wise. Now, being that it's 2016, a lot of these, RequireJS has been around for a few years now. WebPack is newer. So and the reason I'll explain why I chose these and why we, DevExtreme team, feel that these are kind of interesting technologies, even though there's a ton of these technologies that do similar things out there. So the good news is that if you're using something else, then you have the possibility to still use our modules with your solution. But some of these technologies are kind of now the more favored ones. So I'll talk a little bit that later on. All right. So with that, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. And so most everything I show today is related to a couple of articles, which is going to be really helpful for you. And that, again, this you can find under documentation on DevExtreme, and it's a guide for modularity. And so let's talk first and foremost what modularity means. So modularity, as I said, is the ability to break it up into modules. So if you have a DevExtreme installed, and if you go into the installation of your DevExtreme, and if you've got the source option, then you'll have access to source. So if I go into DevExtreme sources lib.js, I'll find in there dxall. And dxall is 2.48 megabytes. It's a pretty big file. And that's because this has a lot of the functionality, majority of the functionality that is necessary for the UI widgets like the pivot grid, the button, the chart, and so on to be able to work cohesively. Now, to take this and break it up requires a lot of work. And so that's what we've done. We've taken all of this and to separate it into all the separate modules, and we'll see that in a minute. The main thing to understand is those modules are now available as NPM packages. And to install them, you just call this npm install DevExtreme, as we'll see in a minute. To really show you how that works, let me show you what it's like to just get started with DevExtreme without any modules, and then we'll convert it to use modules, so that way you can see what's happening and along the way understand RequireJS and WebPack. So to get started with the modules, it's actually really straightforward. All right, we've got a guide here as well, and it tells you exactly all the libraries and the themes that you will have to add. So let's do that. I'm going to do that by using Visual Studio. Now you can do this in anything. I like Visual Studio, and let's call this button DevExtreme. And in it, I'm going to create a very simple project. It's going to be empty. It's nothing selected. And it gives us the bare bones for Visual Studio. And it still puts in the web config file, which I will simply ignore. What I'm interested in is I want to start off by adding essentially just a very simple HTML page. And we'll call this index.html. All right, so far so good. It's just a simple file. Now, next, what I want to do is bring in DevExtreme. So DevExtreme requires certain other libraries. For example, it uses Jquery and Knockout, Globalize, and JSZip and all that. So for different functionalities, I'm using, our DevExtreme is using these libraries, and I need references to those. So I need to bring these in. Now, the good news is you can bring this in a number of ways. If you have it installed locally, for example, if you got the files locally, then you can come into Visual Studio, create a folder called content or JS or whatever, and start adding those files, and then add the script tags to the head section of your main page. That's great. Or I can use a CDN, a content delivery network, and as you can see, we've got one at cdn.devexpress.com. We've got it on Cloudflare as well. But essentially, you can bring these in, start copying them in as well. So this makes a call out to a server that is not on your own server, and sometimes that can have benefits. Or you can bring in a NuGet package. So we can right-click in Visual Studio and just bring in a NuGet package by clicking Manage NuGet Package and all that. However, I'm going to use Bower. Now, Bower is a software package manager technology, and we've created packages of DevExtreme modules. Now, these packages are different than the modules. So these are packages that include DevExtreme Complete, DevExtreme Web, and so forth. So I can bring in this package. Let's do that. And to do that, you're going to need to install Bower. And if you haven't installed Bower, make sure you've got Node installed. Now, that is 2016, and Node, NPM, Bower, and likely RequireJS are probably not new terms to you. But if they are, tweet me afterwards, and I'll shoot you links to any of these items that don't make sense. But if you have, most likely you have Node.js installed. And if you do, then you have access to NPM. And if you have NPM, then you can just simply call npm install, and make sure you get this -g option, and that means global, and that will install Bower. Now, I already have Bower installed, so I won't go through it again. Now, what I want to do is, first and foremost, let's open up this solution. So I'll right-click on Visual Studio here, open folder, and I save my projects in the D folder, as sometimes Microsoft recommends, storing the projects in a different drive than the one you got Visual Studio installed in. Okay, so here we've got the items. Now, Bower can be managed in a couple different ways. if you have in your solution in Visual Studio, if you right click and you create a file called bower.json, and in it you can specify. Now, just to give you an example, what that looks like is if you go github.com/devexpress DevExtreme examples, and in it we're supporting several different technologies. So under the RequireJS jQuery, I've got one called package.json. Now, if I copy this into a local package.json file, this will help me go and get all of the required items, meaning that it says, okay, I've got a dependency to DevExtreme, jQuery, and RequireJS, and it'll grab all those files. I can do that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow along that previous guide that I mentioned to you before that actually tells you. So if I want to get the packages from Bower, all I need to do is call bower install devextreme -- save. And the save basically means save those packages to the local folder. So let's do that. So back into our file here. Now you might say, Mehul, why don't you just create it and let Visual Studio get it? You can do that. And I like the command line approach, but Visual Studio is a great tool as well. And actually you'll see later on, I'll shift to giving Visual Studio an opportunity to do that. All right, so now if I just type in bower install devextreme, Bower will go out to the web, look up configuration for DevExtreme, figure out all the dependencies DevExtreme has, for example, JS zip, globalize, CLDR, etc., bring them down. And now if we take a look, it's created a new folder called Bower Components. Now if I take a look in my Visual Studio, click Show All Files here, you can see it created Bower Components. Now I'm going to right click and say Include in Project. Now when you do this, you may see a dialog pop up that says, hey, this project is configured for TypeScript. Do you want to go get the NuGet package for TypeScript? I'm going to say no because I don't intend to use NuGet. But the reason it does this is because DevExtreme includes the TypeScript bindings. Now, I don't need this, so I'm going to right click on that folder under Bower Components DevExtreme TS and just hit delete. All right, now I've got the packages that I need. So what I want to do is I want to start bringing these packages into my solution. Again, these are the exact same steps. So again, you'll see that DevExtreme is telling me, hey, the first thing you need to add some themes. You need access to the DX common theme and the iOS default theme. And then you want to start bringing in those libraries as well. So let's do that. Now in Visual Studio, if I go to DevExtreme CSS, I've got the DX common right here. So let's pull that into the head section. And then I'll bring in the iOS CSS as well. Next, I need access to a couple of the other libraries. For example, I'm going to need jQuery. So I'll go into jQuery dist and I can pull in jQuery min or the full size one, doesn't matter. And then I can bring in DevExtreme. So let's do that. So I'll go into DevExtreme JS and bring in the DXall.js. Now, as I mentioned to you before, if you haven't seen DXall, if you open up it in Visual Studio, you'll see it's quite a big file. And that's by design. It's got a lot of components that it supports. All right, so now I have essentially what I need to reference, but we haven't actually created anything. So what are we going to create? Well, we're going to keep it quite simple because here we're just trying to understand the technologies at play here. So we're going to add a widget the same way that we're adding a widget here. And all we're doing is we're going to add a button, and we're going to turn that button into a DX button and use that because the DX button has, style, theme support and all that good stuff. And then we're going to add a little bit of code. Now this is knockout, but we're going to use the jQuery approach. But all it's going to do is says, hey, when they click the button, we're going to show hello world. That's it. World's simplest example. So let's do that. To add a button, we're going to add a nested div. And here, all I'm going to do is I've got a div that basically just styles a little bit. And within there, I've got a div that I'm calling my button. Next, to essentially make this all work, is I'm going to make a call out in a script that says, hey, jQuery. So as you can see, I've got my $sign here. jQuery, go find me my button. And it says, okay, it's right there. And then we're going to turn it into a DX button, which allows us to set its text property to say hello world. And then if they click it, we're going to actually say hello world. And that's it. Nothing fancy happening here. So now let's take a look at this in the browser. So I'm going to save and just hit Control F5. And in our browser, we've got a very simple button that when I click it, that says hello world, and it's using the browser's built-in dialog. All right, that's all fine. What if my project got much more complicated? What if I got a lot more libraries? Well, this is where essentially RequireJS, which is a module loader, helps us handle this. So for example, DevExtreme relies on Jquery. So typically we will reference Jquery automatically. But what if you needed to make sure that a particular library that another library was relying on was loaded? Well, in JavaScript, that kind of dependency is very important. And JavaScript, one of its great strengths is that it is very freeform, so you can essentially put one item in a place versus another. So a few years ago, a technology called RequireJS was created. Now, RequireJS is itself a library. So you might say, oh, Mehul, you're telling me I need to put in another library in my package? But honestly, it actually is really, really useful. And so let's talk about RequireJS. Now I've got the browser font nice and large here, so everybody can read it easily. But RequireJS is just a JavaScript file and module loader, and it's optimized for in-browser use, etc., etc. So why did they actually create this technology? Well, they have a great set of articles on there. So if you go to RequireJS docs/y, you'll see they wrote about the whole thing about, like, websites are turning into web apps, complexity grows, assemblies get harder, etc. So we understand now that JS files/modules are super useful. So for example, in our code, typically this set of code wouldn't be in the same page. It would likely be in another file called index.js or main.js, and we'd separate out that functionality to be able to manage it much easier, because likely we wouldn't just have a button. We'd have a grid or a lot more information happening and functionality happening, interacting with each other. And so that can get pretty complex. And so this concept of what's known as AMD. Now, AMD stands for Asynchronous Module Definition, and it's one way to manage modules, and it's a very popular way. And RequireJS essentially loads packages in a asynchronous fashion. And what's really nice about it is, and again, I won't get into the theory behind this. You can read a lot about it. There's a lot of history, for example, with CommonJS and so forth. But I'll link to this stuff in a follow-up blog post. As I said with my main goal is to make you understand how these technologies work together with the DevExtreme modules. All right, so now we understand that modules are super useful. RequireJS is itself very useful. So what we did, and I just did this, is basically this is the world's simplest DevExtreme example. And it could be Angular, whatever you want to use. But what I wanted to point out to you is that all of those samples that I mentioned earlier, DevExtreme examples, are implementations of this similar theme. So for example, as you see, I've got index here, and it's the same thing. So now what I want to do is I want to switch over to using these DevExtreme examples. Now to do that, I'm going to simply call over, and as you can see, all you want to do is copy over this file. So whether it's any one of these, Jquery and so forth, just copy over that file, and we're going to do a git clone, and then we're going to run these particular packages. The first thing is, let's go into command line here. I'm going to go back to my C folder, and I've got a little folder where I like to get some Git projects. So I'm going to do git clone, and we're going to download that DevExtreme examples. And it's pretty lightweight. There's really nothing happening in there because it's mostly just defines the packages that are going to be necessary. All right, so let me bring up another editor here. And I've got Atom installed. I've got Sublime installed. Let's use Atom this time. I think GitHub makes this one. So again, this just points to the same package that we just downloaded. And in it, I've got index here. Now this, actually, you know what? Let me show you the RequireJS Jquery example. Okay, so again, we've got almost exactly the same sample, but we're now written it to use require. And to use require, we've got one key difference, and that is I've got a package JSON file here. Now this package JSON file essentially is just a JSON plain text file, but the key thing in here is it's these dependencies. So now, because I have Node installed, I can come in here, I can say cd DevExtreme examples and go into the require Jquery one. And if I type npm install, npm is going to look at this package JSON file, look at these dependencies, and go and download those dependencies for us and create into a folder called node modules. So this is what the first step I want to do, because basically I'm going to need RequireJS, I'm going to need Jquery, and this DevExtreme is the module version. So let's do this. Actually, we're going to do this, but and again, if I just did this, all this example, it's a ready to run example. I just type npm install and I'm ready to open that up because it's going to download everything I need. So instead, what I want to do is show you, continue with the example that we have on the Visual Studio. So on the Visual Studio version, as you can see, what I want to do is the Bower version is the full DX all. To get the module version of DevExtreme, I got to get it from Node. And so what I can do is I can right click on Visual Studio here and create a package JSON file that points to that package on NuGet. So I can do that, or I'm going to show you another useful command from Node, and that is if I type in npm init, this will help me create a package JSON file. And it's just going to ask me some questions like, hey, what's the name of the project? What's the version number, description? Entry point. This is where does the JS start? Where does your entry point for your main JS file? Now, in this case, I don't actually have an index.js, which I should. It's probably a good idea. It shouldn't be an index.html. And if there's any test command, get repository keywords, who's the author, as well as what kind of license is it, and it's MIT. And it's going to go, okay, here you go. Here's a little package JSON file. Now, if I take a look, if I refresh this here, you can see I've got a package JSON file, which if I include in the project now, I have the opportunity to get. Now, as you saw earlier, the main things that I need in here is actually I need those dependencies. So let's just do that. I'm going to grab only those sections for the dependencies, and I don't really care about the other items. I should, but for now, this is just an example. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to replace a couple of those items. Just say, here's the dependencies. I want you to go out to Node and get these packages. Now, again, I can do this through the command line. If I hit npm install here, it's gonna read this package JSON file, look at these dependencies, and get them. But now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna right click and I'm gonna use Visual Studio to do this. So if I right click on package JSON and hit restore packages, what it's going to do is it's going to go out to Node and get those packages. Now, why do I keep switching between the two? You know, I recommend if you're super interested in it, take a look at Scott Hansman's blog. He talked about it. He's a very prolific blogger, but in essence, he talked about a project an issue he found in Visual Studio, and essentially he's like he was getting some package when one package said, "Hey, this dependency is not installed from FS Events," and turns out FS Events. Because he's on Windows, FS Events is particular to OS X. So Visual Studio basically gave an issue, and it turned out as he dug through that it had to do that Visual Studio has a slightly different version of Node installed than the general Node installed on the system. And he goes on to talk about how you can make it npm install globally over Windows as well, and et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, if you ever find certain issues in Visual Studio, then I recommend to go back to the default at the command line, which is why I showed some of these items today. All right, so now let's give Visual Studio the opportunity. I'm going to right click here. I'm going to say restore packages, and it's going to look at those dependencies, and it's going out to the web, and it's gotten the folders that we need. So now I'm still doing while I'm doing show all files, I'm going to hit refresh, and there's our node modules. Now, I'm going to include these in the project. As I mentioned before, because I've got the bindings in here, if I look at the DevExtreme distribution, I've got that TypeScript folder. So if I did a build here, you're going to find some errors. Just want to point out to you, they're likely related to this TypeScript that if you don't have that NuGet package. So I'm going to right click on that TypeScript folder and remove it as a first step. Okay, so just to make sure, I'm going to build it again and all should be well. Okay, at this point, all we've done is just brought in node modules. We haven't changed our code at all. So let's first take a look at the difference here. And the key difference is, if you take a look at Bower, DevExtreme, JS, I've got DXAll. And DXAll is big. In fact, if I look at the DXAll debug version, it's gigantic. And that's, again, by design, because it does quite a bit. But what if I'm not using a lot of DevExtreme modules, or I'm only using particular DevExtreme UI widgets. Well, this is where the concept of modules makes perfect sense. And this is the hard work that we've done, where we went through all of that code and created a whole set of separate modules. So you can see I've got a ton of modules for each of the widgets, everything from the accordion to scheduler, pivot grid, button, dialog, and so forth. And these I have all been set up in a way that they themselves are aware, because a button, we didn't want to we don't want to rewrite code. And so button is aware, and button will know that, hey, listen, there might be certain things that button.js needs. For example, it requires JS. So it goes ahead and figures out exactly, and require will help us leverage and go and load those modules. So it is modular in a beautiful, beautiful way. I'm super excited about it. Okay, that said, how do we use it? How do we convert an existing item? So the first thing is we need RequireJS in here. Now, we brought RequireJS in as part of this library. So let's do that. The first thing is I'm going to remove references to DXall and Jquery min and use require to load those libraries. Now, require is the only one that I'm going to reference because I'm going to use it to make the call out. So to do that, let's come back here to the script section here. Most of this code will stay the same. I'm going to put this off screen so we can see this a little bit better. And now what I want to do is I'm going to call a couple of require commands. I'm going to call require config, and in it, we are going to set up a couple of parameters. The main one being paths. Now paths essentially takes a key value pair array of items, and in it we can define exactly what we want. So for example, here I'm going to tell require I'm going to need a module that is called Jquery, and this is where you can find it under node modules /Jquery dist/Jquery. And you might say, wait a minute, let's take a look at this. Node modules, Jquery, dist folder, and I see jquery.js. Well, so what's going on here? Well, this is a convention that Require uses, that is looking for the module by file name. And again, I'll have links to Jquery, RequireJS, and some videos that might be helpful that talks a lot more about this stuff. But in essence, you can understand that it's a convention here. All right, so I'm telling at this point Require that, hey, listen, at some point I'm going to be needing this module, so be ready when I call it, and here's where you can find it. So we aren't actually using it at this point. We're simply telling it that we intend to use it. And now the next thing is I need DevExtreme. So I'm going to put in the path to DevExtreme, and that is under node modules /DevExtreme. Now you might say, okay, well, that's kind of interesting because let's take a look for DevExtreme. So I see node modules, I see DevExtreme, but I don't see a DevExtreme.js. Well, that's correct. And that's because we are going to use modules from within there. So I'm simply defining DevExtreme here for later use because we're going to come in here and step through it later on, because I intend to use quite a bit. Well, at least a couple of modules, but in your own code, you can use one or many of these items. Okay, so that simply sets it up. How do we use require? Well, the good news is actually as simple as setting up an anonymous call. So here we're going to use require. We're going to call it, and now we can reference those modules that we had set up before. So the first module that I'm going to reference is Jquery, and the second one is actually DevExtreme. But as we know, DevExtreme itself isn't a module. I'm going to use a module within there, which is located under DevExtreme/UI, and there is dialog.js. So now I can just go DevExtreme UI/dialog.js. Now I intend to use one more, and that is DevExtreme UI button. And now I have essentially everything I need. So I've told Require these are the modules I'm using. And now I can create an anonymous function that allows me to pass in a couple of variables. So the first module is Jquery. Now I could call it anything, but I'm gonna call it $, because that's very synonymous with Jquery. And our second parameter is that dialog, and I'll simply refer to it as dialog. And I don't need to refer to the third parameter because we're simply gonna use it inside the function. Now I've got everything that I need. Let's start using it. So the first thing is, let's bring back some of that code that we had earlier. Now, let me close this off and bring some of this code back up. And in it, we're going to add essentially the same exact code that we had before. Why is that? So what's happening here is we are essentially doing the same thing that we did before, which is saying, hey, Jquery, which is this first parameter that we passed in, I want you to find the button. So in essence, it's doing the exact same thing. But because I've got an anonymous function, RequireJS is only going to load this module when I call it. So now we've compartmentalized that call. And if again, I need to load it up in a future call, Require is smart enough to make sure it loads at the right places necessary. So again, Require is an awesome technology. All right, so that said, Require is loading it for us, and we're still doing the same thing. We're calling it a button, and now on click is still going to call hello world. But I don't want to use the browser's built-in dialog. As we saw earlier, it doesn't look that great. It is simply a browser's built-in dialog. It can look different in different browsers. And as I know, there's a dialog widget inside of DevExtreme. So let's make use of that. And because I'm passing in as my second parameter that module, I can simply make use of it and say dialog.alert. So now I've got everything that I need here to create this require call. And now we've switched over. We've gotten rid of our initial dependencies. So we're not loading the entire DXall at the head section. Instead, we're just calling one function to require and telling require to on-demand load those modules when we need. So now let's take a look at this in the browser and see what's happening. Now, I've still got hello world, but when I click it, I've got a dialog that pops up with the hello world. Exact same thing. Now, to really kind of get the difference between the two, let's compare with the first version so we can understand. So let me make a index.old with the old approach, and then we can quickly see the difference. So let's just call it index.old.html, and I've got the HTML code right here, so I don't have to go through that exercise again. So as you can see, exact same code. We're still loading Jquery, DXall, exact same thing. And now, index.old, when I run it, so I've got index.old here, and I've got index new right here. And so let's bring up our browser tools for both sites here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hit Control F5. So as you see on index.old, the old approach, what we were doing is we were bringing up the index file, common CSS files, Jquery, and DXall. Fine. You know, exactly as you expect. It loads up nice and fast, like less than half a second and all that good stuff. And now, in the new approach, we've got the exact same thing. So one of the key differences being is that we're no longer loading DXall, but we're loading a lot more modules. So you might say, well, what's going on? We've got index, we've got the theme files, require, but now it's loading in all the necessary files that modules it needs. Now, the good news is this is a much larger file, 885 kilobytes. These are bytes, minuscule modules. But, and you say, Mehul, that is great, but that's going to kill the amount of requests coming in. You're absolutely right. And that's not what we want to achieve. And this is where a technology like WebPack comes up. So if you haven't heard of WebPack, WebPack is as they call it, the production unbiased, flexible, extensible, open source module bundler. And we really like it. It's not the only one out there, of course. And I should tell you what I'm about to show you with bundling, module bundling can be done with a lot of tools like probably Gulp, Grunt, Browserify. But the two most popular ones these days tend to be what's known as JSPM. And I think WebPack is the new kid, but WebPack is probably the more popular. Well, we tend to think it's simpler, but JSPM has some advantages that you might like. For example, when I talked earlier about modules, I only talked about the AMD pattern, the asynchronous module definition, but there's other ones out there. There's CommonJS, there's the ECMAScript module, there's global and the register. And guess what? JSPM, which uses System.js, supports different module formats. And again, I'm not going to get into all of this, but if you're likely using one of those approaches, then you can continue to use DevExtreme modules with these technologies. What I'm going to show, essentially, I really like because it's simple, and that's a Webpack. And so Webpack is actually really easy. And as it calls itself, it's basically just a module bundler, which essentially takes not just your JS files, but it can take all your files like the CSS files, your PNG files, bundle them into static assets, which dramatically reduces the number of requests, and it gives you a custom bundle for your particular site. Because as we saw in our Visual Studio solution here, I went from this to creating a custom, using only custom modules. So now I'm only loading those particular modules from DevExtreme. I don't need the entire DevExtreme framework. I'm only using its particular widgets. And so now, using Require, I'm only going to load those particular files. But as we saw, it still loads a lot of small modules. What I want to do is I want to optimize all that and create a special bundle just for this particular site. To do that, we're going to use Webpack. So how does Webpack essentially work? Well, it's actually really easy. And Webpack supports essentially a lot of technologies, but what I like about it, it also supports plugins. And it all starts in Webpack by using what they call a Webpack config.js file. Now this is yet another plain text JSON file that when you've got it defined, essentially Webpack config.js tells Webpack where to look in the code to start optimizing and creating a bundle for you. So let's do that. Now to do that, I'm going to use the GitHub version of this exact code. So this Webpack Jquery, if we take a look at it here again, and I've got the same folder right here open. I'm going to open it, and here now I can see I've got Webpack. I've got index.html, and as you can see, I'm still loading the CSS files, but I'm no longer even loading Jquery, and that's because I'm only loading one file, the bundle.js. So why is that? Well, bundle.js has a particular item. Now you might say, well, first of all, I'm looking at your folder, Mehul, and I don't see a bundle.js. And yes, that's by design because we actually haven't created that bundle. So the way we're going to create the bundle is we're going to run Webpack as a command, and Webpack is going to step through Webpack config, and it's going to say, okay, well, the first thing I'm going to need in Webpack itself uses Require. And Require is going to load the Webpack technology, and it's going to go say, it's going to ask, where do I start? Well, you're going to start at index.js. Well, okay, well, let's look at index.js. So as you can see, we have separated our code out. We took out all the code, put it into index.js, and index.js is the one that now loads jQuery, now loads the dialog, and then, as well as the button, and still calls this. And then Webpack essentially says, okay, well, let me figure out all of the modules that have these dependencies, load them up in the right order, all that stuff, and then it is going to create Minify and all the good stuff and create one file called bundle.js for us. And again, we can make use of plugins, and here we're using a particular one from Webpack called Optimize and Uglify JS plugin and all that. Okay, to use Webpack, you need to install Webpack. And again, how do you do that? npm install -g Webpack. Now you might say, well, wait, Mehul, how do I know to do that? Well, if you've got npm installed, all you need to do is call this Webpack install Webpack -g command. Again, this is the global command, and I recommend you use the -g command. Okay, so I've got this installed, so I'll save you the trouble of watching me install it again, and instead I'm just simply going to call it. Now, first of all, I'm in the wrong folder. I'm in the RequireJS folder, Jquery folder, not the Webpack folder. So let's go into the Webpack folder, and that is Webpack. And as you can see, we made a couple examples: Angular approach, Jquery approach, and Knockout approach. So in here, we've got these items. Now, to run this, I'm going to need those modules first. So as you remember, in Visual Studio, you can simply right-click and restore packages, but I'm not in Visual Studio, so in this point, I'm just simply going to call npm install. And again, we've got all of this documented in our DevExtreme GitHub example. So if you were to take a look at this same Webpack jQuery that I'm talking about, I've done the same thing. Git clone, went into the folder. npm install will help us download those modules, which is the exact same thing we have in Visual Studio. The modular version, I shouldn't say modular, the DevExtreme modules that we're going to require, as well as jQuery and RequireJS. So what's great is it grabs all of those necessary items and installs them into a subfolder for node modules. And now we can simply use the WebPack command. And again, we've got this documented in our project as well. All right, so now when I hit Webpack, it's going to call out to Webpack and go through the entry point in index.js, step through and create what's called a dependency graph. And so now this dependency graph has created a bundle for us, bundle.js. So now if I take a look here, I've got bundle.js. And if I take a look here, back into Atom, I've got the bundle.js. And bundle.js, you might say, is like, whoa, okay, well, what's going on here? But I've got a very special exact bundle that is relevant only for me. And it packages in everything. And I don't have need for jQuery.js or DevExtreme module.js. I've got one bundle.js. And it's only 338 megs. All right, so let's take a look at this. Now, let me do index, and this will probably pop it up into Edge. Edge is not bad. Let's go back to Chrome here. All right, so let's take a look at this version now. So again, when I hit say hello world, it's doing the exact same thing that it did before. The real interesting thing is what's happening behind the scenes. So now in browser, when I hit Control F5, all I'm loading now is the index file, a couple of theme files, and bundle.js. And that's it. But it's not just a bundle that's interesting. Let's take a look at the timeline here. Now, when I reload this, and it's going to take a couple of seconds for it to record. But what happens now is, as you can see, what the amount of time it took to evaluate bundle.js is 238 milliseconds. Okay, well, let's take a look at index old here. Index old is still loading very few amount of files, but now when I go to timeline and refresh this, what it's going to do is going to still do the same thing, load up the files, but now we're going to see the cost of having a really large file. So in our case here, the DXall took a little over a second. Now that's not a lot, but in essence, you can see we've got a huge amount of savings. Now, that is the benefit. And you can see, you might say, whoa, I can't wait to start using this. Again, this you have to be very careful with, because you might say like, well, that makes a lot of sense, but this isn't a typical website. This is just a demo with one button on it and one dialog. Likely in a full site, you're going to be using more widgets. So will you still get the same amount of savings? It's possible, but I think the best part of having the modular approach is that, it helps you to load those items and use only those items that are necessary. And, and then getting a custom bundle means that now you've got your own particular package for it. But again, if you don't want to have to worry about it, and let's say, for example, in the future, you create a custom bundle and then you add another widget and you forgot to include that module. Well, if you've got your build steps right, then, the Webpack and everything will still build that for you. But if you're not sure how to do that, then DXall will have you covered, because DXall has everything that you need and you won't have to worry. But again, this approach is also beautiful. And for those of us that really care about, having something lightweight and using this modular approach, you're going to love it. All right. With that said, let us step back and talk about where we are with DevExtreme and modules. And right now they're released. They're available as part of DevExtreme 16.1. And all you need to do, they're actually out there on Node. So you can simply say npm install, just as I did with DevExtreme, and that will grab the modules for you. With that, I simply want to say thank you. You guys are awesome, and I had a great time learning about this topic, and I'd love to hear from you on Twitter. Email me if you'd like, and I'll hand it back to Amanda. Amanda, do we have any questions that went unanswered?
Hey, Mehul, well, the last one just got grabbed, it looks like. It was from Jaime. Any way to reduce the sizes on Cordova phone, the PhoneGap app with just used widgets?
It's too generic. Could you, Jaime, contact our support? Because what I showed you today is completely possible. Now, I'm not sure if Cordova has a particular modules approach, or if you'd even want to do that. Because Cordova itself is kind of like a very lightweight library in terms of what it's meant to do. It's the plugins that it can really get you. But anyways, you can do essentially what I showed you with any SPA-based application if you want to use DevExtreme in that approach.
Well, Alan says, did you record this webinar? And if so, will you please send the link? And yes, Alan, I can answer that one for you. We do record it, and we will post it to our YouTube channel, and you will also get an email with that link. So yes. Otherwise, everything got answered. Let me see if there's anything cool that maybe you could address. I don't know. Can you see questions, Mehul, or no?
Yes, yeah, I can. And yeah, I think there's been just a couple of interesting questions. Probably at this point, I'm curious how many of you are using some technologies out there. Now, again, I showed Webpack because we feel it's kind of useful, but a lot of what I showed today could be done with JSPM, which is System.js. Even RequireJS has something in it called RJS, which helps you do bundling and optimization, all that kind of stuff. But Webpack I like it because it's simple. You don't have to use it, and I'll have links in a follow-up blog post to some items like this, where this guy actually has a really nice a post about it, and how easy it is to get started with it. There's other technologies out there. I mean, there's other things you can do with Webpack out there. I know this code is real small. Let me blow it up a little. In this example here, which I'll link to in the blog post as well, they're doing some deduping and occurrence order and stuff, but they're using some other plugins for that as well. And you can even pass in parameters like, hey, if it's debug, I want you to create a debug file with the source map in it. Otherwise, create me the minified version. And so there's a lot of interesting things you can do with this technologies. And so my recommendation is, if you haven't already, start playing with it. Okay, so somebody's asking about cache busting with Webpack. So Sophia Amato, that's a great question. I will address that in a follow-up blog post. And just to give you guys a heads up, and it's a shameless self-promotion here, but if you go to devexpress.com/Mehul, you will find the blogs where I just talk about all sorts of stuff web-related. Sometimes it's ASP.NET, sometimes it's the toolkit which we support, sometimes it's using DevExpress reports with DevExtreme. So I love to get feedback about what you guys are building with all this stuff out there. So yeah, please check it out. Leave me a comment, or send me a tweet, and there you go, Mehul Harry. So yeah, reach out to me, or again, email is fine too. Just there's always a lot of emails. And again, there's a guide here that walks you through everything that I showed, as well as the GitHub project.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Mehul.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone.
All right, everybody. So you can check out devexpress.com/webinars. You can see all of our most recent webinars that have already aired and been posted. And coming up next week, you can join us with Don Wibier using DevExpress MVVM Magic with WPF. Don will introduce you to a very cool MVVM framework which ships with our WPF controls. You'll get an overview about what MVVM is all about, plus how our framework can help you implement this design pattern to deliver state-of-the-art WPF desktop applications. And that is August 23rd at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. All right, like I mentioned previously, today's webinar will also be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel. The link is posted in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.